Okay, good morning, everybody. Sorry, I had to run down and grab water. If you ever want to do anything related to live streaming, three most important things you need is you need to have a good computer that can support it. You need to have a decent microphone because remember, a lot of people are going to be listening, and you're going to need a bottle of water because you will get thirsty. Okay. So today what we're going to do is we're going to cover this entire PowerPoint of community ecology. We're going to burn through this thing really quick. I wanted to make sure that we got through this. And then as a side note, free response questions are posted onto both AP Central and onto PowerSchool. So do those, email them to me, and I'll get those put in. The other thing is, if you are watching this, get a hold of every single person you know that is at Snyder and tell them they need to get a hold of their first period teacher if they haven't, and let them know whether they have the two things. Do they have access to a computer, and do they have access to internet? All first period teachers need to know this. So if you're watching this, you're in my AP Environmental Science class first period. If you have not gotten a hold of me, send me an email and let me know, do you have access to a computer and do you have access to internet? I need to know both of those things separately. All right. We don't know what that involves right now, but we just need those numbers. So make sure I get those by Monday. Today is Friday, I know. So Monday, end of the day, if I don't hear from you, I'm going to assume it's a no and send that email out to the people that be. All right, so today, what are we covering? We are covering biological communities and species interaction. This is a fancy way of saying ecology. All right, ecology is my area. So we're going to cover critical environmental factors. We're going to talk about adaptation, so going into evolution just a little bit with natural selection. Excuse me, speciation. What makes a species different from another? How do we know that a German Shepherd and a poodle are a dog, but there are but like a white oak is different than a swamp white oak? What makes those two separate species? We're going to talk about ecological niches, which is really important in establishing a role of an environment. We're going to go over population dynamics, community properties. So what makes up each individual community? Why is a wetland and a forest a forest? We're going to talk about succession, which is something that I find really interesting. And then introduce species, which is where I do a lot of my research at, is invasive species. Okay, so critical environmental factors. So von Liebig proposed the single factor in shortest supply relative to demand is the critical determination in species distribution. Shelford later expanded that by stating that each environmental factor has both minimum and maximum levels or tolerance limits beyond which a particular species cannot survive. So those environmental factors can be water, lack of, or too much, so drought or flooding. It could be like serpentine soils in California, where they have a salt concentration in the soil, and if it falls outside of those ranges, then the species that rely on those serpentine soils suffer. So the tolerance limits fall into a bell curve. Now, this bell curve is shown to be rather wide, but it can be a lot narrower with these zones pushed in a lot more. So you have this optimal condition right here, right? This is where everybody wants to be, or all of the species want to be. Now, as you start to go to the extremes, you end up with this zone of psychological stress. All right, this is where you have fewer species, and those species that are on the outer edges of that are going to basically suffer. All right, that's another word for psychological stress, being they're going to suffer a little bit. So you're going to see in plants, you'll see wilting. In animals, you might see like loss of weight or dropping body fat. You might see people being lethargic or animals being lethargic or very tired. So this role is going to, or what this looks like is going to change based off of the species. All right. Then you have the zone of intolerance. This is where it cannot survive. All right. This is no water, or so much water that it's not going to survive, no food, whatever it is. All right. Looking at serpentine soils, this is no salt, way too much salt. So what that is based off of the organism. Sometimes this zone of psychological stress will be wider or narrower, just like this optimal range can be wider or narrower. And then and one thing with the zone of intolerance is that once it hits this threshold, it cannot survive. All right, once it hits that threshold, it cannot survive. So thinking about it with temperature below 32 degrees, plants will not be able to function because they won't have access to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius. They will not have access to usable water. All right, all the water will start to freeze at that point, and plants cannot survive in that zone of intolerance. And then I guess going back to that, on the reverse end, this would be 100 degrees Celsius. So that would be boiling, because then again, it's not accessible water. So looking at some critical environmental factors, for many species, the interaction of several factors rather than a single limiting factor determines biogeographical distribution. What this is saying is, this is just a fancy way of saying it's never just water shortage, or it's never just shortage of food. It's always multiple things that determine where you'll find a particular species at. Swamp white oak, for instance. Yes, the name implies that it likes to have wetter soils, but at the same time, it's more than just the soil composition that determines, or the water composition of the soil that determines where it's going to be distributed at. So for some organisms, there may be specific critical factors that mostly determine abundance and distribution. When I was in the Navy, we always had a saying that said that whenever a recruit would be like, I need this, you would always say, you need food, water, and air. All right. And so with those are kind of your critical factors. We always say like food, water, shelter for people. And so once you start to eliminate one of those resources, then those are critical factors. And that's when it starts to become detrimental to the species. So think about it as food, water, and shelter, if that helps out. So species requirements and tolerances are also can be used as useful indicators. So there are specific indicator species that we can use where if you want to know the health of an ecosystem, for instance, you should go out and find this specific species. And if there's an abundance of that species, then what it means is that ecosystem tends to be healthy. A friend of mine, Patrick, did a little bit of research into bioindicators. One of his big ones that he really liked was looking at beetles. Since they are the most diverse group on the planet, he went out and he was looking at beetles and was trying to determine if there were specific beetles that can indicate health of ecosystems within a specific region, mostly in deciduous hardwood forests. And you could also look at environmental indicators. So it is one of those things that if you are in, like, let's use Fort Wayne, Indiana, where we currently live as an example. Here, there are specific conditions. We know that we have cold winters and we have warm summers. We know about what the typical rainfall should be and all of that stuff. And we could use those to determine, like, okay, no matter where you are on the planet, if you have these same factors, you should be able to have these same exact species or something that fills that ecological role. So adaptations, they adapt in two useful ways. So it's a range of physiological modifications that are available to individual organisms. And then it is inheritance of specific genetic traits allowing a species to live in a particular environment or population level. Inheritance is important. All right. It doesn't do you any good if you have a specific adaptation that allows you to thrive in your environment and you're not able to pass that on to offspring. So this is explained obviously by the process of evolution. So we'll look at natural selection. Yes, artificial selection does play a big role in environmental science, but we're going to look at natural selection with this. So members of a population best suited for a particular set of environmental conditions survive and produce offspring more successfully than their competitors. Let's break this down into actual English. This means that if you have, let's say, 10,000 trees and there is completely randomized traits within that population, some of them are going to make it onto the next generation and produce more offspring than others. And after a while, it's going to cause a shift more toward those specific organisms. So it acts on pre-existing genetic diversity. But again, remember, natural selection has to operate against the phenotype, which affects the genotype. So limited resource place selective pressures on a population. So an example would be, let's use a white oak tree. So you have a white oak tree, there's a bunch of them growing in a forested area, and then you come across an extensive drought. Let's say the drought lasts for a couple years. At the end of that drought, there's going to be certain oak species that survive and make it. And those are the ones that are able to kind of pass on their genetics. It's either they're able to survive on less water, they're able to get access to the water that's currently there, but that limited resource of water has placed that pressure on that population and is kind of weeding out the other competitors. So let's look at this giraffe right here. All right. If we were in class, we'd have a discussion about this, but we're not in class. So we're going to relate this a little bit more to just kind of me talking, but you could see the different community interactions. So you have this limited availability of water. There are some plants in the background, many of them being short shrubs. There is a tree, but this giraffe has to have access to water. The perspective of this picture shows it as an individual, but there's probably more, which means that this water is going to be is going to be limited. You can see it, there's two small puddles. Now, depending on the number of giraffes, this might be advantageous, all right? Or it might be fine. Like there's enough water to go around. But if you have, as numbers start to increase, then the amount of water starts to become reduced for what each species can have, given equal distribution. Now, is there going to be equal distribution? No. Giraffe is going to go up. It's going to start drinking water until it's fine, until it's not thirsty anymore. And then it's going to move on. And if that means less water for the next individual, then it means less water for the next individual. My dog, for instance, my dog is kind of a jerk. We take him on a walk sometimes. And when we go down the street, there's these neighbors a couple blocks down that leave a water bowl out for dogs, and it says, if your dog wants to drink this, go right ahead. And my dog will go up to it and he'll drink out of it because it's near the end of his walk, so he's a little tired and exhausted. And then, like a little butthole, he knocks the water over when he's done. And so that right there is a level of competition. Is it actually competition? No, because we refill it because our dog sucks. But that it's kind of the same example with this giraffe. He might take more than what he actually needs, and that will leave less for others. Not only that, but these plants in the background also need water. Now, judging by how they're standing water, there's probably soil, or there's water in the soil, some groundwater. But what happens if this giraffe and the herd that he's with leave, and then some buffalo come along, or wildebeest or whatever, and don't really know who else hangs out with giraffes, but they come along and they need to get access to this water, then instantly that supply has to be spread around. All right, so looking at speciation. Speciation is given enough geographical isolation or selective pressure, members of a population become so different from their ancestors that they may be considered an entirely new species. Speciation is how do we make new species? And it mentions a couple here, right? It's due to geographical isolation, selective pressures, all right? a mountain range pops up in between, a flood happens that leads to a valley, and a river forms in there, and it separates species, and that leads to geographical isolation. There's a really famous study that's done with mice, or I think it's mice. Some of them have dark hair, and some of them have light brown hair. So some of them are black, and some have light brown, and they survive at different spots of this area. And it's hypothesized that they were originally the same species that were separated due to a geographical isolation. And then other selective pressures too. One of the things that we talk about, even though there is a debate whether it's natural selection or not, is peppered moths. Peppered moths, they come in black or white, and buildings were originally, as the Industrial Revolution happened, there was a shift in the amount of stuff that ended up on a landscape. And so because of I just got an email. Okay. Because there was a change in the coloring of the environment due to the Industrial Revolution, then there was a shift in the color that stood out when on buildings and trees. Birds were able to see the different color, and it led to this shift from one color to the other. And so that is a selective pressure. Did it lead to a new species? No. It's still peppered moths, but it led to a shift in the coloring, and over a period of time, that can lead to speciation. So alternatively, isolation of population subsets or metapopulations, preventing genetic exchange can result in branching off of new species that coexist within the parental line. And this is complete genetic isolation. This is why one of the factors that's commonly said to is this a new species or not? One of the things that evolutionary ecologists like to use is reproductive isolation. Can these two species reproduce with each other and form viable offspring? So a donkey and a horse forming a mule, that is still reproductive isolation, because a mule is sterile. It is not viable. Compare that to sunflower species. There are two sunflower species, one that likes the dunes, one that likes wet grassland areas. They can reproduce and form a sunflower helianthus that can perform well in both. So are they reproductively isolated, and are they separate species? So looking at divergent versus convergent. So divergent is mutations in different selective pressures cause populations to evolve along dissimilar paths. This is where you end up with how giraffes look like horses, but those selective pressures have caused them to function and act differently. And you have convergent evolution. Unrelated organisms evolve separately to cope with environmental conditions in the same fashion. So the key word in here is that these are unrelated for convergent evolution. So they look alike and act alike, but they are completely separate species. You see that a lot with plants, birds too. So then habitat is a place or set of environmental conditions where a particular organism lives. So think about your house or your city as your habitat. This is where the organism lives at. And then ecological niche is its role or job within that community. So description of a role a species plays in a biological community or total set of environmental factors that determines the species distribution. So what is its job? The easiest way to think about this is with birds, and there will be a bird example coming up. Generalists have a very broad niche. So you could think of this as with humans, omnivores, where you eat almost everything, while specialists have a very narrow niche. So you could think about this as vegans, where they only eat one particular thing and that's it. So with competition, you can see that if the lines represent their resources, right, the resource that they're going to be using, you can see that whenever there's an overlap of their niche, this is where competition happens. This species right here that falls into this area doesn't compete with the ones that are over here, but the ones that are definitely in the center here, they will compete because they share similar resources. while as they start to diverge from each other, instead of these shifting over, it pinches in and narrows. Now you have a smaller area of overlap of competition. So there's fewer individuals that are competing, but there is, and the mean of these has shifted along this resource gradient. So resource partitioning. So it's the law of competitive exclusion. No two species will occupy the same niche and compete for exactly the same resource for an extended period of time. Notice the key word here, extended period of time. Every single species needs water, and therefore there is a competition for it, but that is not a competition that happens all the time. So one will either migrate, become extinct, or partition the resource and utilize a subset of the same resource. Looking at watering holes, a really cool video that you can see online is there's a bunch of animals gathered around a watering hole, and they're all drinking water, and then all of a sudden a lion shows up and they all just dip out, and they just, a lot of them sprint out of there. There's some that are on the opposite end that will remain on there as kind of like a risk reward type behavior, but for the most part they will leave. Given resources can only be partitions of given resource can only be partitioned a finite number of times, meaning there's only so many times that you can use it. So if you look at resource partitioning with birds, this is an individual tree, and you'll notice that each of them has a different area that they occupy, and they're all warblers, which is a type of bird, obviously, but they all occupy a different area in the tree. They all eat different things, so their foraging height is completely different. Notice there is some overlap, but again, if these two birds have this overlap, this is not going to be for an extended period of time, and if it is, it's going to look something like the difference between like the Cape May and the black-throated green warbler, where there's a smaller overlap between them if this persists for an extended period of time. When you see these, it tends to be more of an opportunistic style approach. Population dynamics. So predation. A predator is an organism that feeds directly on another living organism, whether or not it kills its prey in doing so. Prey most successfully on slowest and weakest and least fit members of a target population. The gazelle that gets eaten the most by the lion is usually the slowest gazelle, or the one that is tactically the dumbest. So it maybe, goes right when it should have went left, and therefore it selects against certain individuals within that population. In freshman bio, I always say, why are there no such thing as a slow gazelle? It's because all the lions are fast. And why are there no such thing as a slow lion? It's because all the gazelle are fast. So it's this evolutionary arms race. So you reduce competition, population overgrowth, and stimulate natural selection. Remember that, I mean, it sounds terrible, but if you have 100 gazelle and a lion comes along, or a herd of lions takes out 2 of them, or pride of lions, I guess, takes out 2 of them, you've instantly now reduced the amount of competition for resources in the gazelles, because now they only have to divide those resources among 98 individuals rather than 100. It also prevents the population from getting too large. Looking at this is a really good example to look at, even though it's artificial, is the wolves in Yellowstone. Wolves were removed from Yellowstone National Park, and because of that, the elk were allowed to run rampant, and because of that, they ended up destroying a lot of the plant populations within the area, because there was no check on that population. And then instantly, when they reintroduced wolves, it caused a reduction in the grazer population and allowed the plants to kind of re-stimulate their growth. And it also stimulates natural selection. Again, why are there no slow gazelle? Well, because if you're slow, the lions have selected against you. That's easy food for them. And this kind of leads to this coevolution. Why are there no slow lions? Why are there no slow gazelles? Keystone species, this when thinking about this, think about the wolves again in Yellowstone, about how when they were removed, the ecosystem went through some pretty terrible times. So it's a species or a group of species whose impact on its community or ecosystem is much larger and more influential than would be expected from mere abundance. When wolves were removed from Yellowstone, the ecosystem almost collapsed. Often, many species are intricately interconnected so that it is difficult to tell which is the essential component. This makes it tough because if you are going in and let's say you're trying to control a population of something, you don't know if that's going to be affected. What about introduction of an invasive species? What if it eliminates a keystone species? Even though there's no evidence that an invasive species has led to another species going extinct. So kind of revisiting competition. So interspecific is competition between members of different species. This is, again, the bird example where there was that overlap in the warbler's food chain on that tree, compared to intraspecific competition, which is within the same species. So thinking of this as two of the warblers, like the Cape May is the only one I remember out of that. So the Cape May, if there's two of them in the same tree, they're going to have to compete for those limited resources. It's often intense due to the same space and nutritional requirements. Because remember, it's, you know, you're trying to look out for yourself. And it could also be territorial. You know, organisms defend an area containing what they view as their resources, and primarily it's among members of its own species. So this is intraspecific. And again, that resource can be, you know, it could be a food source, it could be a water source, it could be a mate, it can be a shelter. There's a lot of different things that lead to territoriality within animals. And this mostly has to do with resource allocation and spacing. You know, that's their land, so let them live on their land. Symbiosis is an intimate living together of members of two or more species. This isn't like how I have grass in my front yard, so I have a symbiosis with the grass in the front yard. This is where one species really relies on the other, where they're interconnected. So commensalism is where one member benefits while the other is neither benefited or harmed. There was a bird called an oxpecker that lives on ox and bison and stuff like that. And what would happen is the large animal, as it was moving around, so the ox in this case, as it was moving around, would stir up insects, and then the bird would swoop through and get those. And sometimes there would be insects that would land in the hair of the ox, and the bird would take care of that. We always thought that was a positive relationship, because, you know, the bird is reducing the amount of insects on the ox while the ox is providing food for the bird. But later on, it was found out that it's actually the ox gets no benefit from it at all, and that the bird gets all the benefit from it. So cattle and cattle egrets, same example. Mutualism is when there's a benefit of both species, where sort of like the I scratch your back, you scratch mine example. So lichens, fungus and cyanobacteria is an example. There's a ton of examples for mutualism. Parasitism is, obviously, this is the one that a lot of people really enjoy, because it's where one organism benefits at the expense of others. Humans and tapeworms. Tapeworms is an actual flatworm that lives inside of your gut, and as you eat food, the tapeworm will ingest that food and use it for growth. It's a benefit for the tapeworm and is detrimental for the person that has the tapeworm, because it reduces their nutritional intake. Another example is Plasmodium, which causes malaria. It's a blood parasite, gets into your blood, consumes your red blood cells, reproduces, and then disperses itself using mosquitoes as its animal vector. And so there's a ton of different examples for parasitism. Parasitism is usually everyone's favorite. So how do you prevent competition, or how do you defend yourself against competition? Well, you have these defensive mechanisms. So mimicry is really cool, and it's where a harmless species evolves characteristics that mimic unpalatable, unedible, or poisonous species. Um, and Mullerian mimicry is where two unpalatable species evolve to look alike. I was really hoping that there would be examples there. If you Google examples, it's like butterflies that have eyes on them, or there's some insects that evolve to look like poisonous insects, or snakes that evolve to have the same striped pattern as poisonous snakes, but they're not poisonous. They just do that because then other animals see it and they're like, whoa, we need to stay away from that, dude. Community properties. So yeah, primary production. We went over this last chapter, but this is the rate of biomass production. So it's when you convert solar energy into chemical energy. And we can measure this with net primary production. This is what's left after respiration. So a plant, obviously, not all of the carbon it takes in goes to making sugar or chemical energy. Some of it goes into building biomass and, you know, making producing fruit and seeds and all this other stuff. And so after all the respiration, after everything is done, that is your net primary productivity. Abundance and diversity. Abundance is the total number of organisms in a community. All right, this is different from diversity, which is the number of different species. So if I go out and let's say I go to Eagle Marsh, right? And I measure species in a 5-meter radius circle, and there's, you know, you have goldenrod, Canadian goldenrod, and you have say like small dogwood. There's some cotton, dogwood, cottonwood trees. Say there's some wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace. There's dandelions. If you count 40 dandelions, that's the abundance, but the diversity is the number of different species. All right. So abundance of a particular species often inversely relates to community diversity. If you have, let's say you measure 100 species and 90 of those are Canadian goldenrod, and then you have like 3 giant ironweed, 1 common ragweed. So you could see that how, even though you have a lot of different, or a couple different species in there, it's mostly dominated by one particular species. The abundance of it can be said to be high. As a general rule, diversity decreases and abundance within species increases when moving from the equator to the poles. So around the equator, you have high amount of diversity. And then as you start to move away from there, you end up with less diversity, but you end up with more of those particular species. So compare a tropical rainforest to a boreal forest. So complexity and interconnectedness, that's a word for you for today. So complexity is the number of species at each trophic level and the number of trophic levels. So community diversity may be or may not be complex if all species are clustered within a few trophic levels. So again, going back to the example of the birds, if you look at that, there were 5 birds, 5 trophic levels. And so looking at that, that would have a different complexity than if you were to have, let's say, if you were to look at like a larger range forest. So high interconnected communities may have many trophic levels, some of which can be compartmentalized, meaning that you cluster them differently. So here is an example using an aquatic ecosystem or a marine ecosystem. So the sun is down here and the whales fly. In this, you have, so again, like with any, pick a place to start. So we'll start with the phytoplankton and bacteria. All right, so light ends up going into these phytoplankton, meaning that they can photosynthesize. And protozoa or zooplankton end up eating those. Uh, you also have some krill that eat those. And then the zooplankton and krill can be consumed by the squid, which is then consumed by the killer whale. So this would be a food web compared to a food chain, because remember, a food chain, you just follow one path, while with a food web, it's the interconnectivity between them. So you can do a large variety. So going from phytoplankton to zooplankton to krill to squid to penguin to leopard seal. There are things called whale falls, which you can see that nothing eats a whale just because of their size, right? In order to eat a humpback whale, you would have to be bigger than a humpback whale or be able to divide it up into multiple bits. So how do you get around this? Well, there's whale fall. A whale dies, and then as it sinks down in the ocean, every single thing eats it along the way until it lands on the bottom. And then once it lands on the bottom, then you end up with a lot of species that come along and kind of pick away at it. It's actually really cool. It was one of the things that I found most interesting when I took bio in high school, was that how do you get the energy out of these larger organisms? And it happens during something like a whale fall, where those nutrients are then recycled back into the community. So they end up back in a lot of these other fish, or some of the things that live on the bottom, like the crustaceans, and then bottom fish and octopus and stuff like that. So it's just really cool, like how a lot of this stuff is kind of recycled. So resilience and stability. Constancy is the lack of fluctuation. Inertia is the resistance to move or change in movement. Renewal is the ability to repair damage. So this is one thing when people talk about climate change, a lot of climate deniers will say like, oh, well, once we stop, the ecosystems will just repair themselves. Maybe. MacArthur proposed complex, interconnected communities would be more stable and resilient in the face of disturbance. But also at the same time, you have to think that they're also going to be less renewable. This is controversial, obviously. Edges and boundaries. So edge effect is an important aspect of community structure and the boundaries between one habitat and another. The edge effect is what makes a forest, what makes a wetland, and what happens right on that borderline between a forest and a wetland. Ecotones are the boundaries between adjacent communities. Remember, it's not like in Minecraft where all of a sudden you're walking along and it's just like, boom, you're in a desert. There is going to be this kind of boundary that exists, and those are ecotones. So sharp boundaries tend to happen a lot more in closed communities. You tend to see this a lot with forests, where you just kind of have an edge, and then you kind of have these edge species that it's very small, maybe a meter to 2 meters, and then you're in a grassland, or you're in a wetland. You see it a lot with riparian habitats. Compared to indistinct boundaries, this is more with open communities, where they kind of blend into each other a little bit. So communities in transitions. This is ecological succession. This is one of the things that I love the most in bio and ecology is ecological succession. So primary succession is when a community begins to develop on a site previously unoccupied by living organisms. You tend to see this a lot in Hawaii, because as the lava starts to produce more rocks, that's fresh ground that nothing has lived on. And then pioneering species come in and then kind of take advantage of it. Secondary succession is what you're most commonly going to see. This is when an existing community is disturbed, and then a new one develops after that. So an example would be how with my master's I researched prairie fires, and I measured using fire to control invasive species within a prairie. But the whole point behind that was that you have these invasive, or you have this fire that rolls through and it eliminates all of the current standing plant matter within a community. But then what comes back after that is that a similar plant community, that's secondary succession, because it's not fresh, brand new, unoccupied living ground. So think about it as if you buy a used house versus if you buy a new house, or if you buying a used or a house that someone's previously lived in versus building your own. So primary succession would be building your own, fresh rock, fresh ground, fresh everything. Secondary succession, that ground and stuff has been there before. So terrestrial primary succession, you have exposed rocks, and then your pioneering community, some mosses and lichens come in, and then that starts to produce soils, which then you can end up with grasses, herbs, shrubs, tree seedlings. Tree seedlings are a little bit later on in that. You're mostly going to end up with like smaller grasses and stuff. As those die, they're going to start to kind of form the base so that more of these things can form with thicker layers of soil. Then you end up with your early successional species: aspen, black spruce, jack pines. Jack pines are really cool, but working with them, they give off this. They give off a lot of sap, and it makes them really freaking sticky. Like they're pretty annoying. And then you end up in these climax communities with white spruce, balsam firs, paper birches, and then there are more that are kind of after this as you move through primary succession. So ecological development is a process of environmental modification or facilitation by organisms. Think about it as the lichens are producing soils that grasses can live on. Compared to climax communities, communities that develop and seemingly resist further change. As in, around here, the most common is oak. All right, once oaks start to move in, that's going to be your climax community. They're going to resist change, and usually once you have oak trees, the next step is a disturbance. Equilibrium communities or disclimax communities. I've never heard of this referred to as equilibrium communities. I've always heard it referred to as disclimax communities. And this is where they never reach a stable climax because they're adapted to periodic disruptions. You tend to see this a lot in areas that flood and then go through levels of intense flooding and intense drought rapidly. There's also anthropogenic subclimax communities where humans disturb the population. Think about this as grasses in your front yard, right? If left go, eventually your front yard will turn into a forest. But because we mow and we do other things, there's always this disruption that's happening that prevents it from taking the next step. Introduced species. This is one of my favorite things. I do research into this. And this is introduced species prey upon or compete more successfully than native populations. And if they do that, the nature of the community can be altered. I study plants with this. And usually when you see introduced species, they tend to be more generalist. All right. Human history littered with examples of introducing exotic species to solve problems caused by previous introductions. Biocontrols are an example of this, where you introduce a really common example is a beetle to eat other insects or to prey, or you introduce a wasp to prey upon those other beetles that were introduced. And then when you do that, it ends up preying on everything. So there's again, introduced species, it doesn't mean that it was introduced intentionally. It could be introduced unintentionally. Zebra mussels being an example of that. I did a report when I took invasion ecology or field botany, I'm sorry, where you looked at, here's an invasive species and here's it's native. And it tends to be a lot of them were introduced around colonial times. We're in this new area with new species. Oh, hey, let's bring over game species from where we used to live at, and let's bring over plants from where we used to live at, so it feels a little bit more like home. Mongoose and rats in the Caribbean are an example. So mongoose was there to control rats. So we'll kind of summarize this up. We looked at critical environmental factors. What determines why a species lives at a certain place? Their adaptations to why they live where they live. Natural selection, what happens when pressures are applied to those adaptations, who's going to live and who's not going to. Speciation, what makes a swamp white oak different than a white oak, what makes any species different from any other species, and those pressures that resolve in that. Ecological niche, which is looking at what role or job do animals or plants have within an environment. Population dynamics. What happens when things start to change, or what happens when there's overlap in those niches or within the community? How do those pressures work out? Community properties. Think about edge effects when referring to this. And secession. How does a community move on? Why don't grasslands exist everywhere? Why are there forests? And then introduced species or invasive species. Some of those concepts with invasive and introduced species we'll hit on a little bit later. Then we always have a picture at the end. This is a forest, and this is a thing called a stream. Streams usually run or are smaller rivers that run through an area. And then these looks like a lot of evergreens or conifers. So we burned through that entire thing. That was 45-ish minutes. We're at 48 minutes right now, but that will be all that we go over. Again, free response questions are on PowerSchool. Email your first period teacher. Let them know whether you have access to a computer and if you have access to internet. Let everyone you know, if they have not contacted their first period teacher, they need to do that. Assignments are being posted on PowerSchool. Make sure that you're looking at those. Make sure you're completing those and getting them sent in to me. If you have any questions, send me an email. Other than that, enjoy your weekend. We're going to be moving over to Google Meet for office hours. I will move over there. I'll post the link on to PowerSchool, so look at PowerSchool. But thank you everyone for watching. If you have any questions, send me an email. But enjoy your weekend.